Morning, brothers and sisters. Before we begin, let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, you've given unto us thy servants grace, by the confession of the true faith, to acknowledge the glory of eternal Trinity, and in the power of the divine majesty to worship the unity. We beseech thee that thou wouldst keep us steadfast in this faith, and evermore defend us from all adversities. You, O God, who livest and reignest, one God, world without end. Amen. Again, this is Donald Philip Veach from Jacksonville, North Carolina, and we're picking up our study with Professor Everett Falconer Harrison. We're finishing the Apocrypha. We may press forward today, into the New Testament Greek and the rise of Koine and sources for Koine Greek, etc. Let's pick up here. It should be, let's see, where are we? In certain respects, the New Testament reflects the development of the intertestamental period in a rather positive way. The general worldview is sharply dualistic, and this in a twofold sense. In addition to the contrast between the powers of light and darkness, the antithesis between the present age and the age to come, the latter, which is a staple element of the teaching of Jesus and Paul, is not found in the Old Testament, although the seeds of it may be detected in the prophetic outlook. We take a difference there with the professor. We want to think that through a little bit more, but we stop and pause. There was light and darkness in the Old Testament. He says we see the seeds of it. The kingdom of darkness was in the nations outside of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The present age and the age to come is in pandemic. Oh, not pandemic, but it's endemic to the Old Testament prophets. So if we were in the class with the professor, we'd be raising our hand and discussing with him politely, of course, and academically, we hope, from our side as students, and always as students, respectfully, even if we disagree. We might show honor and respect under the fifth commandment. We do have to object here, and we wish Everett were here, Professor Harrison. Going on, not a great deal is said in the intertestamental literature about sin, yet the doctrine is advanced in two respects. In the Apocalypse of Ezra, still talking about one of the apocryphal books, pseudepigraphal books, there's a grappling with the problem of original sin. How about Job? Or Moses with the Levitical system, which takes original sin profoundly into view. The effect of Adam's transgression is seen humanity-wide. One senses a kinship of Pauline teaching in Romans 5:12-21. The work is late enough to reflect Christian teaching, but it is doubtful that a Jewish writer would make conscious use of Christian positions. In several places, a description of the working of sin in human life is related under the doctrine of the good and evil impulse. Well, Jesus tells us about the evil things that flow out of the heart, and he gives a list of moral corruptions. So does Paul in Romans 7. But any suggestion that this is dependent or related or influenced by the apocryphal literature of this book seems a stretch without further documentation. We insist upon documentation of facts because the original sin is abundantly manifest in the Old Testament. It's more like the apocryphal stuff got their stuff from the Old Testament. So we're not quite as happy as we'd like to be here with the professor's discussion. It's very quick and brief, and maybe he would agree if he were here. Salvation is generally associated with fidelity to the law, but the writer of the Apocalypse of Ezra is pessimistic about the power of the law to save, though he holds it in the highest honor. Well, no, God's the one who saves. God's the one who forgives. To the man or woman who's coming for forgiveness, offering the sacrifice, and the Day of Atonement is all a picture of God's unilaterality in giving us the gospel. So it's not as if we're going to say the Bible saves us, per se. We hold the Bible in utterly high esteem. It's God who saves us. It must be granted that in the realm of redemption, the New Testament does not depend on the Apocrypha, but builds solidly on the Old Testament. Thank you. In the apocryphal literature, the proliferation in angelology is a marked feature. 7 archangels are around the throne of God in Tobit. 6 of them are indicated by name in various places, but the New Testament names only one. The organization of angels and their association with the forces of nature are features of the New Testament teaching. Second coming, Jesus will come with the glory of his angels and his saints, but on a much more restrained basis than in the literature we're considering. The final judgment is a standard item in the apocalyptic writings, but there's a considerable wavering as to the exact place that it occupies in the scheme of the future, whether before or after the Messianic kingdom. The kingdom does not have a uniform treatment. With the growth of the transcendental emphasis, there came a shifting of expectation away from the earthly kingdom to that which is heavenly. That's an interesting insight. The latter became the more common presentation. This left the problem of the earthly, nationalistic promises to Israel to be resolved. It is quite possible that the most finished form of apocalyptic teaching represents something of an amalgam, an earthly messianic kingdom of a temporary character to be followed by the eternal state. This is the pattern in the Apocalypse of John. We see a premillennial hint there. We're going to watch for that with this Presbyterian, good godly Presbyterian man. Seems to be very popular in the 1930s and 40s. Not sure where it is today. It'd be wholly unnatural for the writers of the New Testament to do their work in a vacuum, ignoring the religious ideas that have been taking shape among their own people. Yet the practical absence of direct quotation from the intertestamental literature and the exclusion of apocalyptic fantasies reveal a selectivity that is impressive and may safely be viewed as providential. The contribution of the later literature is there as a factor, but it is distinctly subordinate to the Old Testament influence. Okay. A little brief bibliography here. He appends R.H. Charles, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament, 2 volumes, Oxford Press, 1913. W. Fairweather, Development of Doctrine in the Apocalyptic Period, Bruce Metzger, Oxford, 1957, Introduction to the Apocrypha, R.H. Pfeiffer, History of New Testament Times, 1949. H.H. Rowley, The Relevance of the Apocalypse, Lutterworth Press, 1944. D.S. Russell, The Method and Message of Jewish Apocalyptic, Westminster Press, 1964. And V.H. Stanton, The Jewish and the Christian Messiah, 1886. That one sounds interesting. C.C. Torrey, The Apocryphal Literature, Yale Press, 1945. Well, we close. That was part 1. And we discussed the backgrounds to the New Testament. Again, the temple, the tabernacle. Didn't go into We didn't see much by way of the gospel in the Old Testament in the description. And that's a weakness here with the professor. And then we talked about apocryphal and pseudepigraphal language. That was part 1 to chapter 1. We pressed to part 2, chapter 2, the language of the New Testament. We're talking about the rise of Koine Greek, sources for Koine Greek, some characteristics of Koine Greek, the New Testament writers, the influence of the Septuagint, quotations from the Old and the New, and then the bibliography. And we will be about 15, 18 pages on that subject. And we'll go as we do here, as fast as we need to or as slow as we need to, thinking alongside the professor and asking him questions, and interrupting to ask a question of the professor and dialogue with him, as it were. And that's the model we're working on. It's again, Old Testament, don't forget that. We're in New Testament studies, but this is part of church history too. Talking about the history, the background, the history of Koine Greek, and that languages is a part of church historical studies. And then systematics, of course, that's why I like Robert Raven. He's an exegete, the original languages in a systematic. And we always want to be able to keep our eyes on over here on the people across the street who might come in the back doors of the church. We want to be able to talk to the brothers and sisters in the pews, and if need be, to be talking with the leaders in the academy. The ability to have that far reach. We'll keep our eyes on cultural stuff. Just one quick mention here. Episcopal centers do not require Greek and Hebrew for their men. It needs to be noted, which I attribute to the decline of faith in the doctrine of scriptures. Now on to the language of the New Testament. Far from being a mere collection of books, the Bible possesses a unity that makes it possible for the reader to move with comparative ease from Malachi to Matthew. This is true despite the outward difference occasioned by the altered historical situation and the changed form that Revelation takes, best expressed perhaps by the sweeping contrasts enunciated in the opening words of the Epistle of Hebrews. Both divine and human factors enter into this spiritual unity, and I like the way that's described in the documents of the International Council of Biblical Inerrancy. That is, the divinity of the Bible and the humanity. We look at the humanity side, the author's date, occasion, characteristics, themes, and exegesis, try to ascertain their very precise thoughts. And then the divine, which has God inspiring providentially and preserving, guarding as a custodian his word, making it most necessary for us. So I like the way Prof. Harrison puts that. The fact that God is revealing himself and that he is acting through his covenant people throughout. Salvation is of the Jews, or of the Old Testament church. Of all the writers of the New Testament, Luke alone was a Gentile. You know, I hadn't paused to think about that, but that's true. Matthew, Jew; Mark, Jew; Luke, a Gentile; John, a Jew, apostle; Paul, throughout his 13 epistles, or 14 if we grant Hebrews, which I'm inclined to do. John in his epistles, Peter in his epistles, Jude with his little 500-ton bomb on his F-18, doing an aerial run. That Jude is just ordnance on target. And then John in the Apocalypse. So I hadn't really paused to think about that at one point. But we're thankful for the observation, Professor Harrison. That's helpful. It's a Jewish product. Go on here. This very circumstance, however, poses a problem, for the Jews had largely ceased to use their native Hebrew tongue during the exile, turning instead to the widely current Aramaic, a language closely related to Hebrew. So quite inferably, Jesus spoke Aramaic. Hebrew was kept alive in the synagogues then as it is today. Kids still learn Hebrew in Sabbath school, Jewish synagogues. A New Testament produced in Aramaic was a possibility linguistically, but even so, Aramaic was not ideally equipped for the conveyance of the message of the completed revelation of God, which called for niceties of distinction hardly necessary for the oracular flow of the prophet or the writing of history, but required for the closely knit argumentation of an apostle, such as Paul, such as Luke. And the Greek is rich. I can't wait, brothers, as we get over there in the details with Prof. Murray in the book of Romans. We're going to work through the Greek text. Try not to be overwhelming out here, the practical theology side, but lose some listeners. Well, we got to work in the Greek. But I would recommend reading Romans once every 2 days for the rest of your life. Get Romans in your blood. We'll mention in our studies with John Calvin on Luke that I hope Luke will bring this up, but I'm indebted to Prof. Machen for this observation that Luke 1 and 2 has an Aramaic substratum. It looks like Luke got sources in Aramaic and brought it over into Greek. Again, the Mediterranean basin largely is speaking Greek as well as Latin in Rome, but even in Rome, educated Romans knew Greek. An Aramaic New Testament would have comparatively few readers outside the nation of Israel. Let's pause there for a minute. Remember Luke 1:1-4, as many as have taken in hand to set forward in an account, men who are ministers of the word. The Jewish gospel, the gospel of Jesus, I should say, in Palestine, being told in Aramaic. And that raises the question of Luke's understanding of the Aramaic and his relationship to Paul as his traveling companion. And Luke, the careful researchers, we've discussed him as a historical theologian and a theological historian. Seem good to me, said Luke, having assessed everything from the beginning, to give you an orderly account, akribos, an accurate account of the things wherein you've been instructed, O Theophilus, that you may have certainty, assurance, confidence in what you've been taught. So we got this issue of languages, Aramaic versus Greek, Luke's involvement. On the other hand, if the Christian faith could be set forth in the Greek tongue, which had become truly the international language of the day, the word could penetrate almost anywhere in the Greco-Roman Empire. And as we noted in our background studies, and then also including Daniel, God was preparing the correct moment. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of the Virgin Mary. It was not some fluke, but it was a foreordained with time, with precision, and the omniscience of God, where there's lingual expansiveness to the Greek tongue. Two facts then are clear. God evidently purposed to use his own people, Israel, as the instruments for communicating Christianity to the world, yet their own language was not a suitable medium for the task. God could not afford, he could not afford to lose the Hebraic medium, representing as it did all the background and spiritual experiences of centuries of cultivation. Here's an opportune point for him to talk about the Old Testament, gospel in the Old Testament, but he never takes it. We have to object, Professor. This is a perfect time here and elsewhere to talk about the glory of God and the Word of God and the gospel in Leviticus. Come on now. or the glory of the messianic promises by which the Old Testament saint believed looking forward. We may have beyond something here, brothers and sisters, detecting a flaw in these evangelical fellows whom we love. And more on the premillennial side. Think of John MacArthur and John Piper on the Baptist side. And it was going on. In his providential overruling, he gave to the devout Hebrew heart a Greek tongue in order to make it itself intelligible to the world. It is necessary then to outline the historical development that made this achievement possible. The rise of Koine Greek. Koine, K-O-I-N-E. Greek was in use hundreds of years before the time of Christ and has continued down to our own day as a living language. I met a Greek, modern Greek, and would talk with him, and he could read the old Koine Greek, ancient Greek, because it's still, even modern Greek, there's still a lot of close parallels. And he had a great grasp on some of the Greek words that I would present to him. He and I worked on the word itchy ears in Paul's writing. They have itchy ears. And the thing is that they're running around for the latest report on Facebook, so to speak. The latest piece of news, like on evening news. Everything's breaking these days. Everything's breaking, so everything's broken, so to speak. But it was amazing. He was a graduate of the University of Athens. It was amazing to discuss Koine Greek words with him that I knew from the New Testament. The beginnings of literature may be placed roughly around 800 BC, except we're going to interject here, except Homer and Hesiod, which probably goes back to 1200, but there's issues that are raised in classical studies on the dating of the Homeric literature. Just bypass it. By the time the classical period had set in, two factors had played a leading part in the molding of the language. One was the periodic incursion onto Greek soil of Indo-European people, whose coming brought modifications in the native speech of the various localities. I might mention the Celts who came into Central Asia, who it's theorized were a part of the province of Galatia, in which St. Paul did his labors. There's some discussion of that when you get into his epistle to the Galatians in the background studies. One, due to the broken character of the terrain of the Grecian peninsula, no kidding, one sees linguistically very rocky and mountainous in Greece, along the eastern side, not so much. That was a travel route. But up through the middle of it, oh my. And even from Athens over to Corinth, and even in Corinth, there's a huge Acropolis way up high. They tended to perpetuate themselves, that is, linguistic alterations. In this way, various dialects came into being. While the literature grew up in only 3 or 4 of these, the spoken dialects were many. Of the literary dialects, namely Doric, Aeolic, Ionic, those 3 achieve prominence beyond the others. Ionic, in my understanding, is kind of over on western side of Turkey. It's my understanding. I'm not a classicist. And the Attic was in the Athens area. The Aeolic and the Doric, I'm not sure what region that dominated. Attic, a branch of the Ionic, was the language of Athens, as we say, the city-state that fostered a brilliant galaxy of writers in various fields. Consequently, to speak classical Greek is virtually to speak Attic. This type of Greek was not confined to Athens or Attica, but spread with colonizing activity of the Athenians across the Aegean and beyond. And we want to think about Naples. Neapolis means new city. And it's got a Greek temple there. And also parts of Sicily and the eastern part of Italy. Commercial contacts. And there's Greeks. Greek are in the blood of the Italians. It is the largest single element behind the Greek of the New Testament. Some distinctively Ionic words appear there too, as well as Doric forms. Aeolic influence as a dialect was minimal. In the 4th century BC, the Grecian city-states were conquered by Philip of Macedon up at the north end of the Aegean for his wide-ranging conquest of the Orient, his son Alexander the Great. He recruited men for his army from all parts of Greece. Their close association in the ranks played a vital role in the emergence of a new type of Greek, which had already begun to take shape because of the increasing contact between the various city-states. Those elements of speech that were most widely current already and those that were readily adapted from the various dialects tended to survive, whereas the less useful were dropped. In a remarkably short time, the new Greek medium was forged out, known today as Koine. Its full description is He Koine dialectus. Get the accent right. The word means common. It's the common speech of the Greek. Not the speech of the academy, it's the speech of the market, of government, and the commoners, as Graham Veitch used to frequently remind us. Don't ever forget, we're commoners. She was Canadian, and I've always puzzled over that in later years. We're commoners. Those were not aristocrats and noblemen. We're just rank and file people. I need to ask some of my English friends what that might mean to them. Well, they have a House of Commons in the Parliament as opposed to the House of Lords. They still retain that name. Well, wherever Alexander the Great went, that's important to understand some of this background of Greek history, because that's part of the mental shaping, formation, and the cultural and practical side of the environment into which God's church penetrated. Wherever Alexander the Great went, he died in 323 BC, this language went. Since the conquered peoples of Asia represented diverse national and linguistic units, there was a definite need for a common medium of communication, which helped the spread of Greek in the Levant. Levant's the Middle East. The colonists made hold of the Greek permanent. Only after the passage of several centuries, in the 6th century AD, did the Koine give way to its successor, the Greek of the Byzantine period, which in turn yielded to the advent of modern Greek in the 15th century. But again, my Greek friend told me that even old people can still go back, accustomed to modern Greek, can go back and read the Koine and get it. And even young people, but even in their schools and in Athens, they're instructed in all this Greek history and backgrounds. They have to have mandatory theology classes, grade school up through university. That's rarely known. Very well-educated people in Greece, despite their adherence to the Marxist form of government and Marxism in some form. Well, that's about as far as we can go today. We'll pick up tomorrow. And I'm glad this scribe is doing it, because I spent so many years learning Greek. I've never, ever heard reference in 40 years in sermons and Episcopal context, anybody ever refer to a Greek word, maybe once. If a man's working in the Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and that is a clergyman that suffuses his heart and soul, he can't help but go back to that. And we may well lament the loss of studies in the Episcopal world in this arena. enough on that. Let's pause, bring it to an end. May all of the praise and the honor and glory be to you, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Till tomorrow, God willing. Godspeed.